Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Existentialism is a philosophy that takes a deeply introspective look at the act of being. It could be deduced that the conclusions one might arrive at stem from the personal experiences of the philosopher in question. Thus, while Soren Kierkegaard provided the basis of existentialism within the framework of Christianity, Jean-Paul Sarte provided a much different view within the same school of thought. Today we look at those thoughts and the man himself. Okay, so this is kind of part 2 in what is going to be a 4-part series on the philosophers that are kind of big players in existentialism, and we're going in chronological order. So, there's some hemming and hawing between scholars on who's the father of existentialism, yes. Yeah. But it doesn't really matter because we're going to cover them both. So now Sartre is considered that to have that title by some scholars. So we'll kind of take a look at him the same way we looked at Kierkegaard and examine some of the similarities and differences in their thought, and how that applies to the school of existentialism. Yeah. So Sartre had a pretty interesting life. You want to give us a quick synopsis of it?
Yeah, it's interesting, I have to say, because as I get older, and I realize things that I should have realized when I was young, and probably did because I had professors putting it in front of me, but there's some things that didn't really stick with me. So Sartre lived from 1905 to 1980. Which means the last 4 years of his life, I was in college and I was studying philosophy. Now we did, this sounds like the campfire thing. We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have all these things where you could just go on and, wow, there he is talking and pick up his speeches. So it was only later that I actually could indulge in that kind of thing. But in his life, he was extremely complicated fellow and driven, I would say, and sort of Socratic in the way he looked at himself, because as he described himself, he was not a handsome devil, and he often joked about that. But he wrote and wrote and wrote. He wrote practically every kind, and you and I love to write, Joel. But this is a driven writing. So screenplays, poetry, philosophical treatises, letters, and speeches, and so on. And he developed habits that helped foundationalize and enable that, so that the man drank. I think there are a couple of places where people will tell you that he drank something like a quart of vodka or gin or whiskey a day, on top of massive quantities of coffee. He took mescaline sometimes. He was because he wanted to free himself, he thought, from the social structures. But even before that, he was doing the amphetamines and barbiturates to keep him awake, so he could write. Sort of picture this jittery fellow who also in his life he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1964, and he decided not to accept it because he didn't want to be defined by writing, even after all the writing he'd done, but by actually taking action, which is what his philosophy was about. And so then he did all the various kinds of jobs. In the latter part of his life, he was out. Well, he was protesting in the Vietnam conflict, and he was out doing lots of social action right up toward the end. So he was somebody who kept remaking himself, which is what he was talking about in his existentialist philosophy.
Yeah, and he had a pretty difficult life too, because he was French, and he was obviously in France during World War II, and there's stories of him having to eat maggot-filled rabbits that were sent to him by his uncle in order to survive, and all of these different.
He was in a prisoner of war camp for 9 months, and he had, of all things, he was a meteorologist in World War II. But that it doesn't see there's some existentialist stuff going on there too, because it doesn't matter what you're going to have experiences because of the context in which you find yourself.
Yeah, especially in France. There wasn't anybody in France who was unaffected by the war, much less, the rest of the world. But I think that something that we fail to appreciate being in America, and especially, it's highlighted by, again, we'll reference current events, even though we try not to, the withdrawal in Afghanistan, right? And the entire Afghanistan war. America is geographically and culturally sort of isolated from the rest of the world, being where we are. And so in World War II, definitely everybody was affected by that. You had women forced into the workforce. You had, caps put on the sort of things you could consume. You had all this stuff. But it wasn't like being in France. It was a completely different experience. And those things are definitely capable of shaping people's lives and their views.
And then if you think about, as you say, you're putting us into this grim, grinding machine of war. And in 1943, he writes one of his most well-known books, not while he was in the POW camp, but thinking about it, it's in the camps that he encountered Martin Heidegger's work as being in time and unbeing and those kind of things. And so, not everyone would sit and think about necessarily those things while they're trying to survive.
Yeah.
So he's definitely an authentic.
Yeah. And, it makes you realize that these sort of, I think the thing with public figures, right? And I don't consider myself a public figure, but I have things that are out there, and I've, people who encounter them, right? You hear something like a guy declining a Nobel Prize and, these sorts of things, and you think, wow, that's just crazy. Once you have some taste of being in the public, though, what you realize is, especially if you're a philosophical person like he was, you don't really want to be defined by one thing. You don't want to be thought of as a philosopher. We saw that with Kierkegaard, right? He said, well, I'm actually more of a poet, or these sorts of things. And you realize the line between somebody like Sartre and somebody like Dostoevsky, right? Who was also a prisoner of war and who also was a writer and these sorts of things. And you look at the psychology behind his work and you think, well, these two guys are probably pretty similar in real life, but one is classified as a philosopher and one's classified as a writer. When in reality, the distinction between the two, obviously there's time periods and culture and all these different things. They're two unique individuals, but the way that they approached life and the way they approached art was probably pretty similar in a lot of regards.
I think a lot of the stories that we, and this is not too much of a tangent, but I think it's because it circles right to what you're talking about. And it circles back to the existentialist philosophy itself, which we'll get to. But I knew a gentleman briefly. I don't think I knew him. I can't say that would be too much of a claim, but he was part of a church that I once belonged to, and his wife, she just passed away a few months ago. She was an amazing person. I did know, but her husband was an art teacher. But he was in a POW camp for some time. And what he did, among other things, to survive, was to teach people to survive by doing art. And that's, a person who lives in Wyoming and is not a world-renowned figure or anything, but that's not the point. The point is that art and the humanities of music, writing, art, these are the things that draw out and maintain our humanity. And if you go with the existentialist thought, then it's required of us to then remake ourselves.
Yeah. I was watching the In the Heart of the Sea last night, and I've read the book about the Essex and that sort of thing, and how it influenced Moby Dick, right? And you think about, okay, Moby Dick is a fictional tale, but it's based on this sort of story, and you think about the impact it's had on people's lives and how it's affected people. And in some ways, that's coming from real experiences that actual people had, Mm-hmm. And yeah, it just goes to show that, life can be a reflection of art, and art can have a huge impact on people's lives and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So what were some of Sartre's political views? You talked about how in the later part of his life, he became pretty politically active. In what ways did he view, capitalism or the rest of the world politics? What was his just general views on things?
Capitalism was devastating for people as far as Sartre was concerned. And I think many of us still say that. Of course, that sets off all sorts of alarms. Oh, you must be a communist or worse, a socialist or whatever. Let's just back away from the labels for a minute and just think about it. His point of view was that capitalism's purpose was to make people want things, to encumber their lives with things, and to assure them that they had their place in society, and that the place would define them. In other words, you're sort of almost born into or are taught to find what it is that your place is in this massive machine that is capitalism, and to be encumbered and to never be to always need objects, purchasable things, in order to make yourself feel more human or as if you belong. That's what he decried capitalism for. And I can't say I disagree with him about that. There's no system, and we've talked about this before too, it's not about trying to espouse one system as if it could be purely rendered. But that's where he was, is to say capitalism, Marxism, if applied, would be, to start, a better thing. So he met Fidel Castro. He was somewhat disappointed, and more than somewhat, because when he saw what Castro was doing to human people in persecuting them, then that's not what he was about. And then he thought probably the best political being on the planet in his time was Che Guevara. So he was radical according to most of measures, but he was living his experience.
Yeah. And I think that obviously within the cultural context of America, a lot of why people bristle when you speak badly of capitalism is they think of capitalism as being tied into democracy. And like you said, one of those is an economic system and one of them is a political system. And there's never a true separation between the two in practice. But you can have different ways that these interact, right? And so if you have in opposition to capitalism, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you
don't believe in human rights. No, exactly, because he very much believed in human rights, and that's what he was. The
core of his philosophy is centered around freedom, essentially. So, to say that he, had this aversion to a democratic government would be way off base. But yeah, so he had some interesting views, and he even sort of conceptualized the European Union before it happened in one regard. He saw America, the West, during the Cold War, he saw the West as being holding certain ideals, and he saw the Soviet Union as holding other ideals. And he said, we as Europe sort of need to unite and, not align with either of those two, but have our own, sort of place in the world. So that was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah.
So he lived in a different time than Kierkegaard, as we were talking about at the beginning. What do you think drew him to existentialism?
He was thinking about Kierkegaard. He was thinking about Heidegger's work. And what he, I think, fundamentally came to was that there is no essence of being a human. The traditional often in philosophy, the traditional view is, and this sort of went with that capitalist thing he was talking about, but is that human essence then determines what the person's going to be. And he reversed that, and he said there is no essence. We are the total of our experiences. And so that gives us this anxiety-filled freedom. The horror of freedom is that it is entirely on us in our existence to make of ourselves what we will, to write ourselves, to rewrite. He often used the writing metaphor, to narrate ourselves, and then to remake ourselves and reshape ourselves over and over again according to our choices. Our choices define us. They are ours. Nobody else can make our choices. And he was adamant about that.
Yeah. And, that's sort of the foundational part of his philosophy. And it's also something that is probably the most controversial and that he gets criticized for as well. And it's not hard to imagine why that might be, especially as we've learned more about psychology as time has gone on. It's sort of a nature versus nurture argument in a regard, right? And what he's saying is it's mostly nurture, right? It doesn't really matter what you've experienced in life. You have the choice to do what you're going to do.
And you must, if you're being authentic, think about those choices and not lie to yourself. And there's the other great thing he was talking about was the idea of authenticity being truth to oneself, and truth to oneself is not, and this is sort of where he borrows some from of Kierkegaard, is not to default to the rubrics of and standards of others. I think partly what he gets from Heidegger is this idea of the sign, the people, the human beings, and the they-ness of people. They, and so we get that frequently when we hear it all the time. We often say it, right? They say we shouldn't wear white after Labor Day. They say that you're going to get sick if you have a vaccine. They, the amorphous, undefinable they, which stands for the expectations of the society. And Sartre essentially says, if you default to that and knowingly accept that, consciously accept that, then you are lying to yourself, and therefore you are not an authentic being.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where, obviously our main goal here is to sort of stoke people's interest in philosophy and then have them go back and read the source documents. And this is part where it gets sort of hard, sort of hard if you're a lay person, right? Because you get into his stuff and he says, there's the thing in itself and there's the thing for itself and then there's others, and you end up with these weird sentences where it's like the thing in itself for itself. And you're kind of like trying to suss out, okay, well, what is he saying here? But there are definitely good examples out there that sort of demonstrate what he's talking about. So when he's talking about the thing in itself, right? That's us. The thing for itself is sort of our ego, right? And so a good demonstration of that is time, right? We have this idea of time where maybe if we're, time flies when you're having fun, right? So you're doing something fun, and then all of a sudden you look and you're like, oh my gosh, like so much time has passed. Or maybe you're at work and it's a boring day and you're going, oh man, time's really dragging. Well, the time according to the clock is the thing in itself. It's passing at a given time. Mm-hmm. But the time, the thing for itself, your subjective sort of view of the time is this relative thing that increases or decreases or that sort of thing.
Yes, and it's good that you brought that up, because we have to remember that Sartre, for a chunk of his life, was, like so many others, contemporary philosophers, was working in the era of relativity. The world altering, if one paid attention to it, views of Einstein and physics and so on play into this. So yes, you have this what it is, and then what we make of it. And there's a kind of absurdity to that. And Sartre was also talking about the absurd. Essentially, he was saying something like this: how could you not see it as absurd? You come into the world, it's already made, it already has a history. You can't take all of that in. You can't. So it's absurd to think that you can master it all. And it's absurd to think that everything you do is going to outlast history. No, because we don't even remember our great grandparents. Usually, we think we have this extended view of things, and we really don't. It's absurd to live a life toward making yourself, being true to your choices, thinking about your choices, but never necessarily knowing what those choices have yielded in the lives of people around you. And it's absurd to realize that you're going to die and you have no notion of what your effect has been in any particular sense. So it's absurd. But we're cast into this. And for him, he called it a condemnation. We are condemned to be free. Wouldn't it be nice? And this is why he's referring to other culture. Wouldn't it be nice to just go to sleep and do what they say? And while he's acknowledging, he acknowledges his imperfections all the time. So it's not like he's saying, well, I've got it down and I know what I'm doing. No, that would be absurd. Yeah. It's just, we're wandering around doing things, thinking that there's some kind of linearity to it, when really, for the most part, there isn't.
Yeah. It was funny. I went on a hike with my brother the other day, and we had a long car ride. So on the way back, we're listening to a comedy podcast. And one of the sections is where they say, would you rather do this or that? And one of the this or that's was, would you rather live out your life the way it is now? Or essentially, would you rather live in Groundhog's Day, right? You live the same day over and over again. Yeah. And one of the guys had an interesting answer. He basically said, well, if I was going to live every day over and over again, the family's out the window. He's like, I'm not putting any effort into parenting or being a good husband, because tomorrow I'll wake up and it won't be any different, Mm-hmm. And of course, my brain, working the way it does, extrapolated that out to our normal lives anyways, right? And you think about it, you go, well, we're kind of all going to die, and our kids are going to die, and what effect are we going to have on the universe? Yeah. Is there even any point in being good parents now? If you zoom out far enough, right? You look at the universe as a whole, you're sort of like, well, what does humanity matter? And that's the existential crisis.
It is. What does humanity matter? Yeah. So what matters is only how I conduct myself now by the choices that I make.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the universe. It doesn't change anything, except it makes my life more authentic. And maybe that leads to other lives being more authentic. Probably not. But so it's not. It sounds like a selfish thing, but it's about the best parts of self, acknowledging that we don't know everything, acknowledging that we can't know everything, acknowledging that most things don't even make any sense, which is frightening to people. People want everything to make sense. I've encountered so many people, we've talked about this before, who want novels that just end nicely.
Yeah.
Every loose end tied up and so on. And, well, okay, there's some fun novels that are written that way, and meaningful ones, but that's really, if we're honest, that's not how life works.
Right.
We get kicked in the shins every few minutes sometimes. And, well, where did that go? Oh, that's not how I planned the day. Too bad. What are you going to do with it now?
Yeah. And my brother and I were talking about that yesterday as well, in the context of music and of not, writing. We're saying, okay, if you look up online how to write a perfect song, you're going to end up with the most boring song there is. If you look up how to write a book and you just follow a Campbellian arc, it's going to be boring, right? You have to throw in some twists here or there, or you have to, something different has to happen. Because in real life, very rarely is there a Campbellian arc, right? You usually have several storylines going on at the same time, and they overlap, and usually you're starting another one before you even finish the first one, and it's just this huge complicated thing. And, up until just recently, tragedies were a very common literary trope, right? Stories would end in a way that would be completely unsatisfying to modern readers. You read like, well, why did I even watch this or read this? It's just terribly depressing. But yeah, all of that stuff.
And what were you looking for by watching or reading this? There's where the questions start going.
Yes.
Were you wanting to just be told that the world is all nice? Were you wanting to just to shut off and have entertainment? Sometimes we do. I like an Avengers movie just fine, even though there's a lot of tragedy in even something that is ultimately a pop cultural machine generated by So yeah, and some people get really upset if all stories aren't that way.
Yeah, and this does kind of hit at the core of some of Sartre's philosophy, because yes, to make things even more complicated, he had the thing in itself, the thing for itself, and then later on he introduces the other, and he says that actually, our conscious reflection is the other. It's not even the thing for itself, So you have this whole very complicated thing going on. But another good way to explain it, and a way to sort of simplify it is with an example, and he talks about how emotions aren't just some unconscious thing that springs up in us. He said emotions are intentional as well. So an example that I thought up that's personal to me is, one thing that I'll notice is if the more stressed I get, the more emotional I get, right? And that's probably true across, humanity. Yeah. So every once in a while, if I'm particularly stressed, I find myself having to talk myself down from, simple things, right? If I pull a cup out of the cupboard and another cup falls over and clatters onto the floor.
And you start growling.
Right, yeah. My reaction to that is going to be very different depending on how stressed I am. If I'm feeling good, I'll just reach down, scoop it up, put it back in the cupboard, not give it a second thought. If I'm really stressed, there's going to be a string of obscenities describing how this cup had intentionally
disrupted your life.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And so that's what Sartre would say was that part of an existential dilemma, and probably part of his resistance to capitalism, is when you sit there and you suddenly realize that you're surrounded by objects that are completely indifferent to your existence. Right? So the cup that fell wasn't trying to intentionally harm you. The cup doesn't care if you're there or not, And so emotions, when he's talking about emotions being intentional, that's what he's talking about is, you're putting this effort into giving something that has no intentionality. And what you're doing by doing that is essentially saying that an objective reality isn't out there, but you're trying to make reality based off of your internal states, which is something that he was railing against. Right?
In his novel Nausea, so there's a great name for a novel, but it's true to what he was talking about. There's a quotation, and the character says this: "I am alone in the midst of these happy, reasonable voices, all these creatures spending their time explaining, realizing happily that they agree with each other. In heaven's name, why is it so important to think the same things all together?" and so, yeah, sometimes we think the whole universe is tumbling against us. And ultimately that realizes, and I don't make light of this in what I'm about to say, but it should help us can help us realize that we don't use the word tragedy terribly well. It's so overly applied that there's no tragedy at all. You'd be hard pressed by the definitions of dramatic tragedy or to think that driving across a bridge and a flood takes it out while the car's on the bridge and people are gone. It's a horror. Human life is lost. It's only a tragedy if there was some decision being made by the person going across that bridge who said, despite the fact of being warned that that bridge is going to go out, I know I can get us across that bridge. And the hubris, the pride of thinking that one can outthink nature, that could be tragic. It's a sadness, it's a loss, it's a horror, but it's not. The landslide comes and the village is in the wrong place. And we mourn for the life lost in that village, but the landslide didn't do it, as you just said before. It's the nature of things. Too much rain brings loose soil down. But that, of course, would rankle with people who think there's a deterministic nature to the entire universe, that everything happens for a reason. Well, that's another start with, and that's the kind of attempt at soothing people into sleep, that to protect them from the nature of the universe as it is to let them think that everything happens for a reason. Well, if everything happens for a reason, even if I don't understand why it happened, it's okay because it happened. And rather than engaging with it, you just go with it.
Right. Yeah, and that's why he sort of shied away from metaphysics and sort of geared himself more towards ontology, because he looked at metaphysics as providing answers to unknowable questions. Whereas in ontology, you're trying to figure out, the reasons for things. So we've been talking about him for a while, and obviously we talked about Kierkegaard all last week. What do you think are some key similarities and differences between their philosophies in how they fit within existentialism?
First, maybe even foremost, Sartre wasn't a Christian. And so he wasn't thinking in that kind of context as Kierkegaard was. They weren't poles apart on how they were applying the philosophy, but ultimately what was behind it, or there's nothing behind it. That's really the grand difference between them, I think, to start the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, and that's, do you think, so like we were just talking about, the determinism, Kierkegaard is a Christian. Do you think there was a determinism in his thinking?
In Kierkegaard's?
Yeah.
In this, I'd have all sorts of people trashing me for this, and righteously, but for me, thinking, do I think ask it again, is the determinism?
So with Kierkegaard working within the framework of Christianity, do you think that he had some level of determinism behind his thinking?
Yeah, I think that there was, because even if you believe in the watchmaker God who winds up the universe, winds it up and then walks away to do something more interesting and lets it run, there's still a determinism built into the mechanism, the teleology. What is the use of a thing? Teleology. So form and function, all those kind of things cluttered together. But so a rock is a rock. But if a culture picks it up and values it by saying, I can mash wheat, the rock becomes a wheat masher. We know that the phrase hammer, any tool becomes a hammer, or the variants of that. If you use every tool like a hammer, all you've got is a hammer. And so I think, going back to what we talked about last week, that there is, when you accept that things are absurd. And Kierkegaard was talking about this really, and maybe everything you do means almost nothing, but you still go ahead because you were doing it because God is there somewhere, or you have faith. Kierkegaard talks about faith. Sartre, no.
Yeah, I think looking at the two of them from Sartre's framework, right?
Yeah.
You have this thing in itself, the thing for itself, and the other. You know, he had this view that you couldn't really, you couldn't really relate to others because you didn't have the perspective of them being the thing for itself. So when it comes to the universe, Kierkegaard definitely saw that it related to God as an other, whereas in Sartre's framework, there is no God, so there is no other to relate to that has a responsibility for the universe.
Right. That last part, absolutely, it has no responsibility to the universe. Now, there are others, which is what happens when you engage in an authentic relationship where you're not trying to, as he put it, own the other, but giving the other freedom and still wanting to be. There's a point of relationship, Sartre says, where you grow out of yourself. You want to be all there is for that other. So you're not just one person among many, one object among many. Suddenly you're everything, and that doesn't work out so well usually. And so he wrote a lot about relationship that way. But I guess another way to put the essence of it is that. Ultimately, you live your life, Kierkegaard, not following doctrine. The book says to do this, not Philistinism in any sense. So we follow these rules and therefore something works out. But to live what you find in the stories, to rethink the sacred stories and so on. Sartre would probably say that those stories, because he was a writer, those stories have value in the sense of, are you countering the story by questioning it, by thinking about it, by not just, oh, well, that story is, I'm going to adopt that because everybody says that I should. But it's not about God. It's just about, does that help me make a choice? Yeah.
Sartre wasn't, I don't think he was a Cartesian dualist, but he had that same sort of questioning aspect to him. Do you think we should say more about, do you think we should sort of flesh out what he had to say about freedom and authenticity, or do you think we've covered that pretty well?
I think, I don't want to burn anybody out, but I guess the authenticity part, we can dwell on that a little because it's a word people like these days. Again, I'm trying to nutshell it. Authenticity requires making the choices to make yourself, and making those choices for reasons that seem, at the moment, the ones you must make. Because you must, and not because somebody else has told you to. So to be authentic is always to be realizing the absurdity of life, to totally embrace the nowness. I don't think that's too vague a term. I think most people would get with it, the nowness of things, and thus knowing full well that you might make very different choices 10 minutes from now because you don't know what's coming.
Yeah. It's an important thing to try to get right, because he had a complex view on the past and the present and the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, he also had a complex view on, I understand why you're having a hard time articulating it.
Yeah.
We're trying to get it right for the listeners, though. So his view on ego, right? He was saying that, you know, you don't want to align yourself with your ego.
Right.
So what sort of relationship did he say was an ideal?
Well, let's start with what he said about us. And one of the many things he said about authenticity. If you seek to be authentic, if you seek to be authentic for the sake of being able to say, look at me, I'm authentic, then you're being inauthentic. It's almost there's a kind of Eastern spirituality to it. He'd reject the term spirituality, and I'd accept that. But still, philosophically, if you aim to be something for the sake of being that for others to see and say, look at him, then you've lost it. You're not. It doesn't matter what others think. What matters is, are you being honest with yourself? That's really the core of authenticity. Are you being consciously honest with what you do? So if you go through life and you say, well, all of us do this, right? So he's not being better than anybody else kind of thing. I could have seen myself doing another life, but I had to stay here in this area because X, Y, and Z. And Sarte would say, no, you didn't have to stay. The authentic person says, was I just telling myself that to feel better and not make the choices that I would have made? Then that sounds good and is soothing it over, but you're not telling yourself the truth. You know bloody well that you wanted to do this. And so that's what he's getting at.
Yeah. And I think we all make those choices all the time. And, you know, for instance, having this podcast, right? You know, if we look at it, we could have it on the one level where, okay, I just want to have a podcast, right? And so, and I want people to think of me as a podcaster. Mm-hmm. Or there can be the other part where I think, well, I want to be a philosopher, and I want people to think of me as, you know, as having a good philosophy podcast. Or there can be the part where I just think, you know what? I just like philosophy and I just want to do it, and I don't really care who's listening. So I'll have a philosophy podcast, right? And those aren't three real cut and dry scenarios either. You know, like I've probably felt all three of those at some different point.
Of course.
And like Sarte was saying, making decisions, you know, what kind of decisions you make or your motivations behind them can change from time to time. But the goal would be that latter option, right? Would be, okay, I'm doing a philosophy podcast because I feel that I don't have any other choice. I love philosophy. I love conversations, and I just want to have them. And you want to know what? If nobody's listening, or even if I don't post them to the internet, I'm doing it because this is authentic to me.
That's right? Where we started. And that's where I think where we still are. Yeah. I can't, one of the best parts of my week is doing this with you. And we do, you know, we know that we have people listening, a few people here, there, and on all sorts of continents. And we're glad if people listen, if it gives them some kind of interest or joy to listen. But no one expects people to listen just because they have to. You know, I think this is, you're in education. You're going to have your doctorate. You're working hard at this stuff. And I've been a teacher my entire adult life. And doing the podcast, it makes me feel as if I have the opportunity to be a teacher. But even that's not authentic. The authentic part is, am I being a teacher in a different way? Have I taken a catastrophic change in my circumstances? Have I taken the opportunity? He talked about opportunity. Everything can be an opportunity. You know, and I know I'm going sideways on this, but it often rankled me, the self-help books, the workshops that were brought to colleges and other places so that the administrative language became laced with the term opportunity. We all have, everything is an opportunity. And that was like, to me, anti-existential, because it was using the word opportunity to cloak decisions that were being taken and not honestly presented. So there's opportunity and opportunity. If you embrace an opportunity because you see it as a way of keeping yourself more real, then you know the difference inside. And that's why I've always appreciated that you reached out and we've done this. But it's not a self-congratulatory thing. It's just saying, this is how we're doing it at this moment, in this day. You have dozens of other ways that you do it. And so it's not a competition, right? And I think that's also what Sarte would say to the 21st century folks that we all are. Look at how people compare their resumes sometimes, or their work days. Somehow there's this competition to prove I'm always working. If somebody says, well, I had to work 15 hours today and I just don't have time to do this and so on. Okay. And that's legitimate. But if it becomes, I have to work, and it's not really always the work. It's just, that's my excuse not to engage with somebody else. Well, I worked Saturday. Yeah. Well, I worked Saturday and Sunday. Yeah. Well, and is this a badge of honor?
Right.
This is capitalism making people work so hard because it pays people like they're still in the 1970s. And we're supposed to extol the virtues of all of this. That's being asleep. That's not being authentic, rather than just say, this really could be better.
Yeah. And what's funny is that Sarte actually used the term conversion in talking about some of this, right? That idea of it was this thought that, you have these experiences that are authentic to yourself, and it changes the way that you live. And like you said, that's what's important for why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And why do anything the way I do, right? I could spend, all kinds of time editing this podcast, right? When you or I say a word wrong, I could go and I could take it out. If we have a long pause where we're thinking about something, go and take it out. If I say something that's contradictory to something I said earlier in the episode, I can go back and fix it. But that's not authentic, is it?
No.
So instead, I let the whole thing play out, and I let people see how messy it is. I let them see the stupid things we say. I let them see the brilliant things we say, because that's authentic, right? And I do the same thing with music. I don't sit there and try to get everything just right, and so that it's this perfect record. I try to record things, and I try to mix things in such a way that, is it ideal? Yes. It's an ideal performance. But it's an ideal performance that could be replicated in a live scenario. I have one set of drums, one set of bass, two guitars, a vocal, so that it's not this artificial thing. It's something that's an authentic piece of music. And so, this idea that, the motivations behind doing things for the way they are.
This is why I think that, even though there are a lot of naysayers about this, and the big guns in the field, and all of these positions that they take, for fine reasons, there's authoritative academic scholarly work, and I'm of that world. There is authority. There are well-taken positions that have been well-researched. And here I am just, talking as a reader, as a teacher, a former teacher, on an introductory level, right? Knowing full well that I could turn around and find a page that I go back to this afternoon and say, well, yep, got that wrong. But did the universe end? No. What if I'm able to say, got that wrong, going to try to rethink that? That's the path I think Sarte would have us on. This is why I think existentialism is so desperately with us.
Yeah, because
in this moment.
Because this is what it boils down to, right? You and I have a responsibility to be authentic and to make choices in this moment about the conversations we have. But that's not where it ends. A listener can't be asleep and take what we say and apply it as truth. They have a responsibility, right, to be authentic and to think for themselves and to make choices and to
integrate. And to keep questioning.
Right. Exactly.
And to, well, okay, I buy it. I don't buy it. There's a capitalistic metaphor. Yesterday on NPR, I was listening to Science Friday, as I often do. There was a discussion by a very authoritative scientist who was talking about essentially there's a lot of fancier names for it, but the conveyor belt of water circulation in the Atlantic, a planetary sized process. And so the salinity and the heat and cold twisting this conveyor, bringing cold water to the warm, bringing warm water to the cold movement, which keeps life moving in the ocean. And it is measurably slowing down. It has slowed down 20% in the past 50 years. And the questioner was saying, well, how do you measure this? And she's presenting the data, and can we pinpoint a date when it's all going to come to a stop? And she said, no, there are too many factors for that. But if things continue as they are, roughly, it could well come to a stop within the next 40 years. And if that engine stops, we have no technology or capacity to start it up again, maybe in a few thousand years, but not now. And she's talking about the size and immensity of this. And while I'm driving along thinking of this, I'm thinking, Sarte. Why? Because it's a vast universe. It's a vast machine. It's absurd to think that we can just fix it. But it's not absurd to think we could make more authentic choices about how we actually acknowledge this and what do we contribute in small ways in our lived lives toward maybe making that machine keep going. But she and the questioner finally said, well, where's your point of hope in all of this? And she said, I don't have that. I see no way for this not to happen unless everyone now takes everything that's been said for decades and applies it as a priority. And I don't think that's going to happen, she says. And he said, do you lose sleep at night about this? And she said, it drives me crazy some nights, but so I retreat. I go to, she essentially said, I go to sleep on this. I go to something else and be entertained. I just say, what I'm doing about this is being a researcher and trying to put the information out there and encourage people to do something with it. That's my way of coming to terms with, have I done anything? And I thought, that's so totally existential on the scale, the individual human, the immensity of this. Every second, the heat that's generated by this current in the ocean is over 100 nuclear reactors. I didn't know that. She was presenting the data about this. The amount of water that we're talking about moving every second is 100 Amazon rivers. And so the hubris it would be to say, well, we can fix that.
Yeah, there's this weird thing, and I think you're right to think of Sarte when you think of it as, you have some people on one end of the political spectrum who are denying science, and it's using those emotions we were talking about before, right? Mm-hmm. That idea of the cup dropping out of the cupboard and getting very angry. They're using that as a justification for not denying the research or not doing, the due diligence on it to figure out that it's a problem. And you have people on the other side of the spectrum who, might be relying on science to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. And that's inauthentic. So like we were talking about earlier, you're just sort of going to sleep, right? You're taking the responsibility off of yourself. You're putting on somebody else to do something about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Sarte had a lot of insight into the psychology and the ethics behind these sorts of things. Like we were talking about with Kierkegaard last week, right? That the bystander effect. Yeah. You see something terrible happening and you just assume, well, somebody else is doing something, right? Yes. I don't have to take any action because somebody somewhere is doing something about this. You are your era.
that's essentially what he was saying. You are within the zeitgeist, within the cluster of things that formulate your time. You can't live in some other time yet, right? And so he said this about the way he's talking about World War II. And so, like it or not, this is your war. This is all of our war. This is not the war of some people who get sent over to some. This is everyone's war. You embrace it and you do something. You make the choices within that context. So it's not like you have endless choices. And there's the other part of this is you are condemned to be in this time period, whatever that time period happens to be. And thus, the choices you make are in some ways formulated by the context of that time. Not determined by it, but there are some limitations. You can't just, well, I mean, you can close your eyes and go to sleep and say, no, I don't exist. No, this isn't happening. But if you're being authentic, you're making your choices, but they're still within that context.
Yeah, it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning about how, a lot of philosophy had looked at it as an essence and then an existence, whereas Sartre was saying, no, you exist first and then you're in the essence of your sort of time period and things. So what was the relationship between phenomenology and existentialism for Sartre?
All right, so phenomenology is talking about encounters with objects and what you make of the relationship with those, the encounters. What is that? This is what's telling you about the world, the senses. All right, and so that's not inconsistent with what he says about the objects of the world, as you were referencing before. The stone, the landslide, rain, even other people who we don't objectify, and yet they are a material that we encounter, and our senses do guide us through that. But he went beyond. I think he's going beyond the five senses. To me, he was. If you're acting in the interior, based on trying to suss out what is the right choice for you, you're taking in data. He never rendered it in this way, but you're taking in data, but you're also sometimes thinking way beyond the physical. If you're thinking about the universe, just the physical universe, that's enough. But if you're thinking, I'm alone and I was tossed into this, there's a little bit more than just the five senses going on there.
Mm-hmm. I wish we had time to get into it because it's super interesting. His thoughts on imagination, right? And how imaging comes into the brain and stuff. And that's actually a huge part of his philosophy. We should try to say something about it before we end.
Yeah, I agree. Go for it. I'll clarify if I need to.
Yeah, and I wasn't real clear on it. I'll be honest. So,
all right.
Yesterday was my birthday, so that's an existential crisis in itself. So I didn't get time to do as much research as I wanted.
That's okay. So let's go with this. And happy birthday again. Yeah, it's interesting. You and your brother's birthday are so close. Here's one of the things he said. No matter. Well, he wrote a book called the Imagination, essentially. No matter how long I may look at an image, I shall never find anything in it but what I put there. Now, you see, the phenomenologist would say, well, you're taking in red, you're taking in green, you're taking in whatever. But what I put there, it is in this fact that we find the distinction between an image and a perception. When I encounter a song by you, I, of course, know it's your voice. I'm hearing that. I know it's your creation. I'm hearing that, but I don't stay in that spot for the duration of the song and listen to the lyrics. I'm to feel how the music moves me. When I see a piece of art, whether it's one that I've made, like this week with my art lessons, or grand pieces by all sorts of individuals, which I get to study. We all get to look at art. You'd have to be hard pressed to just ignore the fact that art is around you everywhere. But if you look at that and you say, what's that supposed to be? Sartre would say, I think that that's the equivalent of saying, I'm waiting for people to tell me what I'm supposed to think and make my choices. And if you say, that's a piece of crap, it's a bunch of metal stuck on a street. All right. And why do you have such a visceral reaction to that? To just label something without going into it is not authentic for him. So the imagination is about what do we place? What do we find? What do we superimpose because of our choices?
Yeah, and art is real interesting that way, especially if you are an artist, right? Because I remember listening to music before I was a musician, right? And it was really all about the feeling that it inspires. And then I became a musician, and then I learned several different instruments. And then there came a point where all of a sudden I realized I could appreciate music in several different ways, right? So I could still listen to it for the feeling that it had, but I could also listen to it and dissect, okay, well, what is the guitar chords being played? Okay, well, what is the rhythm that the drums are playing? What sort of bass guitar and amp combo is creating this sound? These sorts of things. And so that falls into that image versus perception kind of categorization. And the same thing can be done with art, brush strokes, and that stuff.
Imagination is not the same as perception, because perception is what we take in. Imagination is what we make of it.
And his big quandary there is like you said, if you're asking what's that supposed to be, and that is the big thing with art, right? Is like I've talked about before, lots of times I like to write lyrics in such a way that, okay, there may have been an initial meaning for me, but I don't want to spell it out for listeners, right? I try to cloak it in as much, aesthetic and abstract metaphor as I can, so that to me, I can listen to the song and know what I was writing about. But then I've had 5 or 6 different people come up to me with 5 or 6 different explanations for what the lyrics are about. That's what I love about it, right? I'm not trying to tell people. That's not the enjoyment that I get out of music, giving my message to people, right? My enjoyment of it is putting out something out there and not having it be a secret code, because I don't ever really want people to decipher what it was, but I just want to see what people make of it for themselves,
Yeah, this is what people often approach poetry with. I play, as I do in a lot of things, writing some poetry. I'm not a published poet. I'm not authenticated that way, but I can appreciate poetry. I'm a literary. That's been my study my whole life, is literature. But I know poets who, if not make their livelihoods entirely out of it, do have that authentication. And we have a couple of whom are, we're close. We have conversations. It's not like, whoa, poet, capital P, therefore can't talk. But when you try something, then it becomes a whole lot more immersive, and it takes your thoughts places. I do, because I'm dense, I think, but I do have a fundamental disagreement with Sartre on the idea. He said you can never learn anything from imaginary objects, because you've constructed those objects through perceptions, perhaps through experiential things, but ultimately you've constructed that imaginary thing in your mind, and therefore it's not going to yield something you can learn from. And I think I disagree.
Yeah, I almost wonder if you could empirically say that, because what I think about is black holes, right? So we had the mathematics to describe them.
Yeah.
But mathematics is really you're interpreting something, right? It's data, and then you're trying to imagine it. Imagine what it's like in reality without having the technological ability to actually observe it, actually picture it. But the level of precision with which we were able to predict these things, I think we learned a whole lot out of something that we weren't able to actually, out of something that was essentially imaginary until we had the technology to perceive it.
And this is reminding me that I also need to go back and read The Imagination and its translation again, which means I'm not really reading Sarte. I'm reading somebody's somebody's translation. And therefore it itself is a secondhand or third-hand experience of, but anyway, the perception as opposed to the imagination. That's really, to go back to what you were asking about phenomenologically, the perceptions come through the senses, but the imagination does overlays and applies and finds things.
Yeah. All right. I think that we did as best as we could trying to figure out what Sarte was about. And I'm sure as we look at our other two existential philosophers, we'll be able to add some clarity to his point of view within the framework of existentialism as a whole, as approached by these other people.
You know what I would love? I'm going to add this before you close, because it just occurred to me, and if I didn't do that, it would just be, let's just follow the same old pattern. Suppose that a teacher of philosophy in a university heard this and listened and said, "Oh, no, they've gotten it wrong." Wouldn't it be wonderful then to have students listen to 10 minutes of this and then say, "No, let's talk about where these guys are, where they got it, perhaps somewhat accurately, and where they don't," because there's another authentic exchange.
Yeah, that's what I hope a lot, and this comes back to when we were talking about epiphenomenalism, right? I realized when I was talking about my views on it, I talked about how an amygdala is an epiphenomenalist organ. But then I think that I sort of implied that the prefrontal cortex wasn't, but that leads into the brain being the sole, idea behind it. Yeah. What I realized is I articulated it in such a way that people would be like, well, wait, what is this guy even talking about? Because he's still saying that the brain is responsible for all of consciousness. But I hadn't fleshed out the thoughts that were in my head. I hadn't said everything that was in there when I did it.
Right.
And my immediate thought was, oh my gosh, there's going to be people that hear this and they're going to think, oh, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's an idiot and stuff. But then my next thought was, I hope that somebody would just listen to it and think, well, maybe he'll figure that out later, or maybe it wasn't his full thought, or, well, if that's what he's saying, maybe there is something to epiphenomenalism, and I should sort of think about it from this perspective or that sort of thing.
Well, that's the human.
And that's what we were talking about, right? That's the authentic desire. Is we don't want to sit here and say that we're authorities on philosophy, because the fact is, there are no authorities on philosophy. That's why philosophy is a study within itself. There is a systematic framework, but by necessity, it's addressing questions that cannot be empirically solved through science or through reason or rationality. You're using a framework to try to address things that are beyond the scope of human understanding. And along that way, you're going to make mistakes, or you're going to say things that are controversial, even if they can't be disproved. But the hope is not that somebody thinks of us as authorities on philosophy, but the hope is that people just think about philosophy.
That's it. Yep.
So, I look forward to continuing on with our existentialism. And until next time, keep pondering.